Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic, let's do it. What's the most disturbing thing that you've ever seen while on the job? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I responded to a call about a child wandering down the road. I showed up and found a child barely old enough to walk who had a very full diaper. We interviewed people in the area and eventually found the child's home. I walked down to the home to talk to the family, and I realized that a window of the home was open with no screen, which is how the baby must have gotten out on the road. It was also about 4 feet off the ground, so it was a scary fall for a 1-year-old. I knocked for about 10 minutes before Mom came to the door. As soon as she opened the door, all I could smell was feces and rotten trash, and I immediately noticed she was super high on something, which we later found out to be heroin. She was barely coherent, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to talk to her, and she needed EMS anyway. So I asked where the dad of the baby was so I could maybe talk to someone more sober. She pointed me into the apartment and said couch. So I went in while gagging because of the smell, and then I found my dad dead of an overdose. That was a rather disturbing experience. An older gentleman was having a really bad seizure at a library. He was just sitting there reading a book and then looked like he dozed off looking at the cameras later. A patron came up and said this gentleman was making weird noises, so I went to check on him. I came upon him having a full-blown seizure. I called 911 and he ended up being okay, but holy moly. There was also a different gentleman who just collapsed and passed away at the self-checkout at the library as well. I worked as an investigator for death cases in Germany for around 10 years. So I've seen some serious stuff. One of the more gruesome cases was an accident between an elderly couple and a BMW Lazetta, the small old-timer with almost no front nose, and a small delivery truck. The driver went asleep. The smell of blood was present 50 plus meters away. No gore horror could be worse. I could tell a lot of stories though. Many were hard to look at, sad, or both. I worked at a pretty large Canadian grocery store. One day, a 14-year-old girl that I worked with came to me, and she asked me if she could ask me some questions. I said sure, and she pulled out her phone and showed me some pretty vile messages someone had been sending her. I didn't want to repeat what I saw because it was so disgusting. As I'm reading, she tells me they're from a guy at our job who works in the produce department. I asked who it was, and she says the name of some 26-year-old man. My stomach sank. I told her she 100% needs to go not only to her parents, but to a manager, because there's no reason a 26-year-old man should be saying that to someone who just turned 14. I showed her what time our manager was in the next day and told her she needed to report that. It turns out she was not the first child he did this to. They did an investigation and found multiple other young girls, some who still worked there, and some who just straight up quit because they were so scared to work with him. I worked at a wood factory, making a large assortment of lumber products. I was working on Saturday for overtime. My machine was a molder and was on one end of a large factory floor that had at least 50 other large machines. I was walking to the back corner of the building when I heard someone screaming. I ran the width of the building, and on the far end away from me, I could see a coworker with his arm and shoulder deep in a machine we called a mule. The mule took rough lumber boards of various widths and cut them lengthwise into smaller boards to be used in other machines. It's the size of a dump truck, and in the front is a 60-inch wide feed table that can be adjusted to suit different thicknesses of lumber. In the front are 2 very large pressure rollers, one on top of another on bottom, that grab the wood and feed it to the 60-inch wide head, which essentially has any number of large table saw blades spaced out along its length that cut the wide board into smaller boards. When I came around the corner, he was on his knees, with one arm shoulder deep in the machine's feed table that was set to accept boards that were 15 to 16 inches thick. He saw a piece of wood, 1 by 1 by 10, swatting at the emergency shutoff button on the other side of the machine. These machines have a lap bar along the feed table that if you bump it, it shuts off the machine. It was common knowledge that this particular emergency shutoff was not functional. What made it worse was that the secondary emergency shutoff button on the front of the machine was also not functioning. I had to run the length of the building, 300 feet, to reach him. He had passed out by then. Run past him and around the large machine to the rear, where there was a third emergency shutoff button for those who unloaded the lumber as it came out. His entire arm had been in that machine, through a gap less than an inch under two 16-inch wide pneumatically pressurized infeeder rollers that were just spinning on his arm the entire time. The blades were deep enough that his arm never reached them, but that didn't matter. The infeed rollers had essentially stripped all the meat off the crushed bones of his arm, from mid-bicep to wrist. Once the machine was off, I immediately called 911. It was just us two working in that building that day, Saturday. Unfortunately, that machine was literally the oldest in the factory. It was the first machine the owner purchased when he started the business. It was from the 1950s. The infeed table adjustment was known to jam, and of course, it did with his arm stuck in the machine. I called on the radio for help, and it took me and the maintenance guy that arrived 20 minutes to unjam the infeed table in order to lower it and free his arm. By this time, paramedics had arrived. It's probably a good thing his arm was stuck between those feed rollers, because had we freed it right away, he would have most likely bled to death before the ambulance arrived. We had some mutual friends outside of work, and when they drug tested him, he failed for weed. They threatened him with his job, and he signed some legal papers saying that he wouldn't sue them, and that they would pay his hospital bills and let him keep his job despite failing the piss test. Neither of the machine's operator side emergency shutoff buttons were functional. He could have sued them for all their money, and he would have been in the right, but he let them off the hook over a failed weed test and keeping a shitty $12 an hour factory job. Insanity. He did keep some of his arm, i.e. they didn't amputate what was left. I've seen worse shit in my life, but his arm was completely shredded when it came out of that machine. He'd gotten a couple of fingers stuck under a shortboard while feeding it into the machine, and it pinched them so tightly that he couldn't pull them out, and it sucked his whole arm into the machine slowly. The inside of the machine looked like someone dumped a 5-gallon bucket full of blood into it while running, just pieces of his arm scattered around inside of it. This was back when I was in the US Coast Guard working at a Lorraine Sea transmitting station in Spain. It was time to swap out the 8-foot-long insulators on the guy wires of our 500-foot-tall, 200-kilowatt transmitting antenna. We weren't allowed to turn off the transmitter for more than a few seconds, so this had to be done live. An engineer from the UK was dispatched to do the most dangerous hands-on part. We flipped off the transmitter power long enough for him to climb up the tower, then turned the power back on so he was part of the live circuit. I was a safety observer on the ground. The guy wire was lowered, and he reached out to grab the fiberglass insulator about 1 foot from the ground wire with his gloved hand. The whole reason for replacing the insulators is that they were old and breaking down and leaking power across 8 feet of fiberglass. 1 foot of old, dirty fiberglass between his gloved hand and the ground wire was not enough to protect him, and I could hear the high-power, low-frequency transmission arcing through his body. I screamed at the guys manning the power-off safety switch inside the transmitter building, and they cut the power. The literally shocked engineer was frozen in place about 8 feet off the ground, and when the power was cut, his body fell straight down. I was afraid he was dead, but no. He started moving and got back on his feet. He had a deep burn on his hand and one on his foot that he'd been standing on when the electricity entered and left his body. But other than that, he was okay. We all took the rest of the day off and went downtown to a bar, had beers, and debriefed on the day's events. Yeah, after something like that, and surviving, which was great, that's a good outcome for a situation like that. That is the correct debrief, at least as far as the military goes, for sure. When I was 14, I briefly worked at a coffee shop. We had a regular who would come in, order a drink, sit down, and unzip his fly to let his member hang out under the table. He'd occasionally stroke it and be visibly aroused. The owner thought it was all hilarious, and ribbed me the first time he did it around me. I understand humor was probably her way of coping with an effed up situation, but both the patron's behavior and her reaction to it were really disturbing. I quit shortly after. A client in a full-blown bipolar psychosis episode came into our office to talk to one of the attorneys who luckily knew what was going on and was able to redirect them until proper help came. The client was rapid cycling between meltdown sobbing and maniacal laughter, kept talking about how the attorney was the only one who wasn't trying to poison them, that their entire stash of jarred foods was poisoned, and kept trying to give the attorney the enormous amount of cash they had on them. They'd emptied their bank account that morning. I wasn't trained to handle anything like this, so I just had to sit back and try not to make anything worse by interfering. Mental illness is very, very sad to see firsthand. Outside of my time in the military and deployments to Iraq, probably my current job at a university, where I found a kid that either fell or jumped off the 4th level of a parking garage. I had no idea how long he had been there, or if it was intentional or not, but I called 911 and stayed with him until the ambulance took him away. Pretty sure he survived. Hotel guest there for 5 days, never left his room and declined housekeeping. The room below him reported a dark stain on the ceiling, so my manager and I went to the guy's room expecting a leak, and instead found him lying in bed, soaking in his own bodily fluids. He was alive and lucid, and even apologized for making a bit of a mess. I can't even begin to describe the smell. We called an ambulance and they took him away. The mattress was soaked through with urine, feces, vomit, and blood. It had all leaked through the floor and into the room below. We had to get a specialized biohazard crew to clean everything up, and the room and rooms around it had to be sealed off for several weeks. I don't know the details of what exactly was going on with him, but the GM managed to contact him later to charge him for the damages. It was my first year working for US Bank, and I had just flown into Minneapolis, Minnesota for a town hall meeting. I took the elevator up way too high, and I found myself on a floor where there was like a subtle cry in the air. I kept walking, and I turned into a room that looked like it could be the auditorium, but it was a conference room. And a woman saw me and immediately apologized and said, "This is where we all come to cry, sorry." And I ran out of the room. I used to work at a major chain hotel. We got a call from the family of one of our guests asking to do a room wellness check since they hadn't responded to their phone for a while, and calls to the room were not getting picked up. I knew immediately when I walked in the room that she was dead. She had a taped plastic bag over her head and sprayed some sort of aerosol can through a tube into the bag, suffocating herself, I imagine. It was horrible, and the worst part was that I knew her sister was waiting on hold downstairs. I made my manager break the news to her. I couldn't do it. Not me, but a friend told me this story. He was working in a methadone clinic, and they served the methadone in liquid form in little paper Dixie cups. An addict came in, drank it down, and then threw it up all over the table. Knowing they wouldn't give him another dose, he slurped up all his puke off the table. Ugh. I worked in home care, so I suffered my fair share of declining health and deaths. One that really stuck with me was an easy 2 to 3 hour sit, basically having to keep an elderly man company while his wife went out. This meant sitting, drinking tea, and watching TV, which was a dream when you've been washing people since 7 a.m. This morning, however, he wasn't feeling well and went to the toilet. He was in there a bit too long, so I knocked and asked if he was doing all right. He responded in a horrible, slurred way. I told him I was coming in. One side of his face was drooping and he wasn't making any sense. I called 999 and waited until they got there. His wife turned up just as the ambulance was pulling in. Luckily, they got him to the hospital and he made it. I just kept thinking about whether I had left him in the toilet for too long, or what would have happened if I hadn't checked in on him. I had a panic attack and called the office. They told me to have my dinner break and get back to work. I really wasn't made of tough enough stuff for that job. Not me, but a friend. He was a rural paramedic years ago and got called out in a domestic abuse case by the police. Of course, the cops were on the other side of the district, 40 minutes away. Anyway, they got there first, could hear screaming, looked in the kitchen window, and saw the dude holding his bare-assed wife down in the hot red stove. He and his partner said "F it" and went in without the cops. Fortunately, they were able to talk the guy into letting her go. Cops arrived about 10 minutes later and driving about 100 miles per hour down rural gravel roads. He quit at the end of his shift. I was working as an overnight doorman and security guard in a bad apartment complex. A naked woman went off the 9th floor balcony. I watched her die at my feet. She took a few agonal breaths, but there was nothing there could be done, as she was a mushy inside the skin. I finished out the rest of my shift like any employee should, and then I went to classes like any student should. I never realized how common this was until I worked there, which was sad. I used to be a server at a retirement home. One building was for the residents who were just retired, so they didn't need a whole lot of assistance. But the other building was for residents who had Alzheimer's or dementia, and I knew how to work both sides. One night I was closing up dinner time, and there were no caregivers in the dining room that was also attached to the living room. All of a sudden, I smelled the worst smell I've ever smelled in my 25 years of life, and when I looked up, a resident was literally head to foot covered in, I'm hoping, her own shit. She was munching on it too, and she got super close to me and offered me some. She had it in her teeth too because she smiled while offering it. I backed away super fast and said no thank you, but thankfully 3 caregivers ran in to give some PPEs and basically dragged her to, I'm assuming, her room to give her a good 5-hour shower. I was told later on that happens a lot more than you'd think, not just with that particular resident, but with people who have Alzheimer's or dementia. It made me, and still to this very day, it makes me sad. They're right though. I was there for 7 years and it happened like every other day. I used to work in a casino that was said to be haunted. Several staff had experienced various things there in the past, such as weird noises behind the fire door, ashtrays being flipped over back when people could smoke in there, strange whistling sounds, people calling out from empty rooms, etc. I only ever experienced one thing personally. I was eating lunch in the staff room, a McDonald's burger, fries, and a milkshake, and when I finished, I stuffed the wrapper in the cup, placed it on the counter, and continued reading my book. A few minutes later, the damned cup flew off the effing counter and bounced off the table. There's no way I could have done that, as the table was about 5 feet away. So even if it had been displaced or blown over, no breeze in the room, there's no way it could have leaped 5 feet at me. I did graveyard shift in a gas station in a super shitty area when I was younger. One night a pretty hot drunk girl called and asked if she could use the toilet. I apologized and said no, as it was a security thing. She begged me and offered to show me her body. I again said no, and she could if she wanted, but I wouldn't let her in. She stripped, took the biggest shit I'd ever seen at the time, and then wiped her ass with a burger wrapper on the ground. She got dressed and asked if I liked the show. I said it was great, but the rest of the staff will love it more. I then indicated to the security camera above the cash register that it had captured everything. She called me see you next Tuesday and left. It's been over 30 years, and I still wonder what happened to her. I used to work in an automotive plant. A lot of stuff happened, but I didn't witness it all. One I did witness was a car in a lift that fell over and missed the guy getting out from under it by inches. Stuff I didn't witness myself: a guy had a heart attack and died on the line. A guy holding a drill on a golf cart punctured his artery in his left leg when the driver hit a forklift. Lady came out of the roll test booth too quick and sandwiched another lady between 2 cars. A guy was on a massive forklift and going into a new building they were constructing while looking backwards and pointing to something. He grazed the side of the entry with his forklift and snapped his left arm off at the shoulder. A contractor was working in the ceiling after hours without his partner and had an aneurysm. Workers found him hanging from a safety harness the next morning. The last one, a guy went to work on a car elevator in the paint shop without doing a lockout or tagout, and it came down on him and decapitated him. Warning: blood, suicide, self-harm, addiction. I worked as a therapist and clinician in a jail setting for a bit during COVID. Days were usually fine, but nights were kind of creepy. We had a couple patients that would engage in self-harm on the unit, You'd be surprised at how much blood can splatter, even when it's not that much. It was always awful and terrifying to see. My unit was very lucky to not have anyone suffer long-term harm. The worst, though, was finding inmates hanging. He had managed to pry loose the air grate on his cell and hanged himself with a twisted-up sheet. It was my boss who found him first. Against all odds, he found him in time. We got the cell door open and the COs got into his cell, lifted him up and saved his life. The guy avoided brain damage too. Insanely lucky. Thank goodness for that. I was transferred to an emergency room for a couple of years after that. We weren't traumatized, so I didn't see the worst of the worst. But watching liver ascites get drained was pretty gross. You got used to it, but it's something that I remember seeing on my first day that stuck with me. Since I worked primarily with addiction there, I saw recurrent patients start to get sicker and sicker as addiction took its toll. But that was more of a subdued feeling of sadness and pain.